April 1943, at 25 feet above Caen, France. The cold air shimmered against the canopy of a Focke-Wulf 190A5, flown by Lieutenant Karl Henning of the Luftwaffe. Below him, through thin veils of cloud, heavy American fighters were climbing laboriously toward the sky. Massive, barrel-bodied machines of steel and noise, the P-47 Thunderbolts, making their first appearance over occupied Europe. They looked like flying barrels, Henning said over the radio, his voice calm but laced with amusement. Laughter crackled through his headset. The Americans must be desperate. Another pilot joked. They're sending flying cows to do a fighter's job. From 27 feet, the air was crystal clear. 16 P-47Cs of the 4th Fighter Group strained upward in tight formation, their Pratt Whitney engines roaring under the burden of 7 tons of metal and ammunition. To the veteran German pilots, men who had fought from Poland to Britain, who had survived hundreds of air duels, the sight was absurd. They were used to the sleek lines of the Bf-109, the elegant agility of the Spitfire. By comparison, the Thunderbolt looked like a bomber pretending to be a fighter. "Don't waste your ammunition," Henning quipped, half serious. "They'll fall apart before we even reach them." Another round of confident laughter filled the airwaves, the laughter of men who ruled the skies of Europe. For at that moment, the Luftwaffe was still the master of the air. For 4 relentless years, they had crushed every opponent: Poland, France, Russia, Britain, leaving behind burning cities and broken squadrons. To pilots like Henning, the notion that a fledgling America could challenge them was almost comical. But what Henning didn't know, what no German pilot circling above France that morning could possibly imagine, was that they were witnessing the birth of the machine that would end their reign. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, mocked for its bulk and shape, carried within it the cold arithmetic of destruction. 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, 400 rounds of ammunition, Grues rounds per minute of pure, industrial fury, a wall of lead that could erase anything caught in its path. In that moment, the Germans laughed, but within 2 years, that laughter would be drowned out by the thunder of 8 guns. In the summer of 1940, as German fighters swept across France, the U.C. Army Air Corps sent an urgent message to Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, New York. They needed a new interceptor, one that could climb high, fight fast, and survive above 25 feet. The man who took on the task was Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born engineer with a deep, practical mind. He studied the request and shook his head. "They want a lightweight interceptor," he told his design team. "But the war has already changed. We need something that can outlast the enemy, not just outturn him." What Kartveli designed was unlike anything before. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't light. It was huge, a 10,000-pound fighter wrapped around the most powerful engine available, the Pratt Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial producing 2,000 horsepower. During its first test flight in May 1941, the prototype shocked the engineers. Its massive turbo-supercharger filled the rear fuselage like a second heart. The plane looked heavy, almost pregnant with metal pipes and ducts running through its body. A test pilot standing beside it muttered, "Does this thing actually fly?" It did, and when it reached altitude, it flew like nothing else. At 27 feet, while other aircraft gasped for oxygen, the P-47 still had full engine power. The supercharger, fed by exhaust gases, gave it sea-level strength in the stratosphere. It was an aircraft designed not for grace, but for endurance, a machine built to survive. Still, many American pilots hated it at first. Training squadrons in Connecticut and Florida lost men and aircraft learning to control its immense torque and weight. It ground-looped on landing, rolled violently on takeoff, and dove so fast that the controls froze under compressibility. One young instructor, Captain Earl McIntyre, fictional, wrote in his logbook, "The Thunderbolt isn't a plane you fly, it's a beast you have to tame. Once it trusts you, it'll protect you. Until then, it tries to kill you." But those who mastered it discovered something extraordinary. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, a quiet farm boy from Oklahoma, climbed into the cockpit for the first time and later said, "It felt like sitting inside a locomotive." The power didn't end, it just kept coming. The P-47 was ready for war. What no one realized yet was that its strength, the very thing that made it feared and hated by its own pilots, would soon make it the most dangerous fighter in the sky. When the P-47 Thunderbolt first entered combat over Western Europe in the spring of 1943, the results were disappointing. The German aces of Jagdgeschwader 26 quickly learned how to exploit the Thunderbolt's weaknesses. It couldn't turn with a Focke-Wulf 190 or climb with a Messerschmitt 109. During those early weeks, the Luftwaffe pilots mocked the Americans. Major Josef Pieps Preller, a respected German ace, wrote in his diary, "The new American fighter is large, slow, and stubborn. It climbs like a cow and dives like a stone. Easy prey for our boys." At British airfields, even RAF pilots joined the laughter. They called the P-47 the flying milk bottle. One joked that the best way to dodge the enemy in a Thunderbolt was to unbuckle and run around inside the cockpit. The statistics seemed to confirm the ridicule. In the first month of combat, American fighter groups lost 14 Thunderbolts while claiming only 3 enemy kills. Many young pilots wondered if they had been sent into battle with the wrong airplane. But hidden inside those defeats were clues to a different story. Mechanics began noticing that damaged Thunderbolts returned from missions riddled with holes yet still flying. At Debden Airfield in England, one P-47 landed with a missing elevator, punctured fuel tanks, and more than 100 bullet strikes. The ground crew stared in disbelief. A British officer nearby remarked, "If that had been a Spitfire, we'd be sweeping up pieces from the countryside." The R-2800 engine, protected by its massive radial housing and free of fragile coolant lines, could take punishment that would destroy a liquid-cooled aircraft. Pilots realized that this thick-skinned machine could survive long enough to bring them home. Among the new American squadrons, a quiet change of attitude began. The laughter from above no longer mattered. The men in those big, awkward Thunderbolts were learning that brute strength could be as valuable as speed or agility, and that the real measure of a fighter wasn't how it looked in the air, but how many of its pilots came back alive. By the summer of 1943, whispers about the Thunderbolt's toughness were spreading among American pilots. But no one truly believed the stories until Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson proved them in the skies over France. Johnson was a 23-year-old from Oklahoma, quiet, disciplined, and devoted to his squadron, the 61st Fighter Squadron of the 56th Fighter Group. On a cloudy morning over northern France, his formation was ambushed by a group of Focke-Wulf 190s, led by Lieutenant Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, younger brother of the famous Adolf Galland. The Germans struck from above with perfect precision. Cannon shells tore through the American formation. Johnson's Thunderbolt, flying near the rear, was hit hard. Several 20mm shells exploded across his fuselage. His canopy shattered, the cockpit filled with smoke and hydraulic fluid. The engine cowling ripped open like paper, and fire licked at the instrument panel. Johnson's nose and leg were bleeding from shrapnel. He tried to bail out, but the canopy was jammed. A shell had deformed the track. Trapped inside a burning aircraft at high altitude, he fought to keep control. Against all odds, the P-47 kept flying. He managed to level the aircraft and steer west toward the English Channel. The controls barely responded. Oil streaked across the windscreen until he could see nothing but a blur of black. Below him, a single Focke-Wulf 190 broke away from the fight and came after him. No one knows for sure who that German pilot was. His name was lost to history. He could have ended Johnson's life easily. Instead, the strange duel that followed would become one of the most remarkable moments in air combat. The German fighter closed in and opened fire again and again. Tracer rounds sparked off Johnson's wings. Cannon shells punched into his fuselage. The Thunderbolt shuddered violently, but refused to die. When his guns fell silent, the German pulled alongside. Johnson later said he could see the man's face clearly, young, fair-haired, staring in disbelief at the wreck that somehow remained in the sky. The German shook his head, raised one hand in a brief salute, and then banked away. Johnson's P-47 limped across the channel and reached Manston Airfield in southern England. When it landed, the ground crew counted over 200 bullet holes and stopped counting. One shell had exploded inches from Johnson's head, another had severed part of the main frame. Yet the aircraft had carried him home. Engineers who examined the plane realized they had underestimated their creation. Reports sent to intelligence units in both air forces described the event in disbelief. The Germans, reading their own pilots' accounts, refused to accept that any aircraft could survive such punishment. But it had. From that day, the legend of the Thunderbolt began, and so did the end of the Luftwaffe's laughter. After the summer of 1943, American pilots began to understand that the P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't built to fight like a Spitfire or a Messerschmitt. It was a completely different kind of machine, heavy, powerful, and nearly indestructible. Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, was among the first to see this clearly. He gathered his men one evening at the Debden base and told them bluntly, "Stop trying to turn with the Germans. You'll lose every time. Use your weight, your speed, and your guns. Dive hard. Strike once. Then climb back into the sun." It was simple advice, but it changed everything. The Thunderbolt's great mass, once considered a weakness, became its greatest weapon. When it dove, gravity and power worked together. Nothing in the German inventory could match its speed in descent from 30 feet. A P-47 could reach more than 550 miles per hour, faster than any Luftwaffe fighter could follow. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin, one of Zemke's most daring pilots, refined the tactic. He and his flight would climb high above enemy formations, roll upside down, and then dive like falling hammers. As the speed increased, the air around the aircraft howled. When they reached firing range, the 8.50 caliber guns spoke at once, a storm of bullets so dense that anything caught inside it simply disintegrated. Pilots began calling these attacks boom and zoom, though some jokingly referred to them as Thunderbolt turkey shoots. For the Germans below, there was nothing funny about it. A Luftwaffe survivor later described the experience. They came down like falling stones. You didn't have time to dodge. You saw flashes, then pieces of airplanes in the air. The transformation in the American units was dramatic. Losses dropped. Kill ratios improved. The Thunderbolt was no longer an awkward experiment. It was a killer. And behind the success was the hard-earned lesson that had taken months to learn. In the P-47, survival and victory belonged not to the pilot who turned faster, but to the one who struck first and hit hardest. By mid-August 1943, the American daylight bombing campaign was reaching deeper into Germany. The target that day was ambitious: the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and Regensburg, vital to the German war machine. It would be the longest and most dangerous mission yet attempted. The bombers needed protection, and the P-47 Thunderbolt was chosen to escort them as far as its limited fuel allowed. For many pilots, it was the first time they would face the full strength of the Luftwaffe head-on. Major David Schilling, leading the 62nd Fighter Squadron, briefed his men early that morning. He pointed to the map and said simply, "Stay above the bombers. Don't chase them down to the deck. Let the Germans come up and then hit them hard on the way down." Over central Germany, the first waves of German fighters appeared: Messerschmitt Bf-110s, twin-engine heavy fighters loaded with cannons and rockets designed to tear apart bomber formations. From 28,000 feet, Schilling and his flight rolled into a dive. The sky turned into chaos. Gunfire and smoke filled the air. One German gunner who survived later told interrogators, "They came down like thunder from the clouds. I fired at them good hits, I thought, but the American fighter did not even shake. Then it fired. The aircraft ahead of me broke in two. Gone in an instant. 8 German fighters were destroyed in that single dive. The Thunderbolt's guns, 8 Browning M2s firing in unison, created a 6-foot-wide cone of death. Within seconds, aircraft caught inside simply vanished." Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabby Gabreski, another rising ace, described the experience in his combat report. "When all 8 guns meet at convergence, there's nothing left. I saw one enemy fighter fold in half mid-air. You don't chase him, he's already gone." That mission revealed both the P-47's power and its greatest limitation. Its short range forced the American escorts to turn back before the bombers reached deep inside Germany. Without cover, the bomber crews suffered terrible losses. Yet despite the cost, the Germans had learned something new and frightening. The American fighter was no longer a laughingstock. Its firepower was unmatched, its armor nearly impenetrable, and its pilots were quickly becoming experts in a kind of aerial warfare that played to every strength of their machine. The flying barrel had earned its baptism by fire, and the laughter from the Luftwaffe was growing quieter by the day. By late 1943, the Thunderbolt's advantages at high altitude became obvious. The Pratt Whitney R-2800 with its turbo-supercharger held power where German engines began to fade. Above the cloud tops over northern France and western Germany, the P-47 felt strongest, just as the Focke-Wulf 190 and Bf 109 started to gasp. The change showed in combat results. German leaders who once mocked the aircraft now faced it with caution. One of the Luftwaffe's best, Hauptmann Hans Philipp, met P-47 as near Braigny-Cordon, France during a high-altitude interception. The engagement ended quickly and violently. Philipp's aircraft was destroyed in a burst of heavy fire. The loss sent a shock through German units. If a veteran of hundreds of missions could not survive a clean Thunderbolt attack at altitude, others would fare worse. On the American side, experience and hardware improved together. A new paddle blade propeller arrived on late-model P-47D airframes. It gripped the air better, improving climb and acceleration, especially with external tanks. Pilots noticed the difference immediately. After a test flight at an English base, one crew chief remarked simply, "It leaps now." German pilots felt it too. In his diary, Lieutenant Heinz Knoke described a failed bounce near Hanover. They expected to climb past the heavy Americans. But the Thunderbolts matched the climb and then tore into the formation on the way up. What had been a safe escape lane became a trap. There was also the sound. Ground troops and civilians below learned to recognize the deep rolling thunder of the big prop at high RPM. Rumor and slang spread along the front. Soldiers called it a thunderclap that meant trouble was coming. By early 1944, with drop tanks slung under the wings, P-47s could push deeper into Germany. They still did not have the ultimate range of the Mustang, but within their patrol windows, the sky changed character. German fighters that tried to climb through the escort screen were met by organized dives, short bursts, and clean separations back into altitude. Veterans on both sides understood what had happened. The P-47 was no longer a big machine trying to act like a nimble one. It had become exactly what it was designed to be, a high-altitude hammer. When it struck from above, it ended fights fast, and with each mission, the Luftwaffe had fewer experienced pilots left to answer back. When the invasion of France began, the Thunderbolt left the high skies and came down to the dirt and smoke of the battlefield. From dawn on the beaches of Normandy, the deep roar of radial engines rolled over the gray Channel waves. Hundreds of P-47s flew low across the fields, roads, and hedgerows. They were no longer hunters of fighters. Now they were the hammer for the ground troops below. Loaded with 501 0.0-pound bombs, rockets, and full ammunition belts. Each mission carried enough firepower to break a column of tanks. Major Francis Gabby Gabreski led his men from the 56th Fighter Group over the invasion zone. Through his radio came the sharp, urgent voices of ground controllers calling out targets, fuel trucks, artillery pieces, convoys trying to reach the coast. The Thunderbolts dropped through low cloud, released their bombs, and then turned their 50 caliber guns on anything that moved. One German officer, Captain Hans von Luck, wrote later that the first sign of the Americans was not sight, but sound, a growing rumble that shook windows before the planes appeared. They came in pairs, silver and brutal. When they left, the road was fire. Even soldiers on the Allied side were startled by the power of their own machines. Infantrymen advancing beyond the beaches sometimes stopped to watch the P-47's attack. A sergeant remembered shouting to his men to cover their ears before a Thunderbolt passed overhead, because it was like standing next to a train engine that was on fire. By the time the front moved inland, the Thunderbolt had proven itself as the perfect ground attack fighter. Its thick armor and air-cooled engine could take hits from rifles and small flak without failing. Many pilots returned with their wings full of holes, their bomb racks empty, and mud splattered across the underside but alive. With every passing week, new tactics appeared. Pilots flew in pairs. One dove in to attack, the other watched for hidden guns. They learned to fire rockets in salvos to open tank columns, then finish the survivors with guns. The big fighter that had once been laughed at for its size had become the soldier's closest ally, a guardian angel made of steel and smoke. From Normandy's beaches to the hedgerows of Saint-Lô and the crossroads of Falaise, the sight of a diving Thunderbolt meant rescue for one side and disaster for the other. Far from Europe, another kind of war awaited the Thunderbolt. The skies over New Guinea, the Philippines, and the wide Pacific Ocean demanded range, reliability, and the ability to survive brutal tropical weather. The 5th Air Force, under General George Kenney, introduced the Thunderbolt to the Pacific in late 1943. The aircraft's bulk seemed out of place among the small islands and narrow runways, but its strength and power soon proved invaluable. Colonel Neil Kirby, a quiet Texan known for calm precision, became one of the first to show what the P-47 could do in the Pacific, flying from rough strips carved out of the jungle. He used the aircraft's dive speed and firepower to ambush enemy formations. In one engagement, he and his small flight attacked a group of Ki-43 Oscar fighters. Kirby shot down 6 enemy planes in minutes, a feat that earned him the Medal of Honor. The Japanese pilots, accustomed to quick, turning duels, found themselves helpless against the Thunderbolt's method, a single crushing dive, a storm of 50 caliber bullets, and a climb back to safety before the lighter aircraft could react. Saburo Sakai, Japan's most respected surviving ace, later recalled facing the new American fighter. He wrote, "It looked slow, heavy, and clumsy until it dived. Then it became a flash of silver death." In the following months, P-47s attacked Japanese airfields, barges, and troop positions. They strafed runways, destroyed fuel dumps, and provided cover for advancing Allied troops. Tropical storms often hit without warning, and mechanics worked knee-deep in mud to keep the engines alive. Yet the Thunderbolt endured the heat, humidity, and the corrosive salt of the islands far better than expected. Later versions, like the P-47N, were designed with long, elegant wings to hold extra fuel tanks, extending their reach across the Pacific. With these, the fighters could escort B-29 bombers on long-range raids toward the Japanese home islands, flights that lasted more than 2 miles in those vast stretches of ocean, where navigation was done by compass and dead reckoning. Pilots learned to trust the roar of their radial engines more than any map. The P-47, which had begun its story over the fields of France, now finished it under a burning Pacific sun, a symbol of persistence, power, and endurance in every corner of the war. By the final winter of the war, the skies over Europe had changed once again. The Luftwaffe, battered and desperate, began deploying its last great weapon, the Messerschmitt Mi-62, the world's first operational jet fighter. The German jets were terrifyingly fast. They could outrun any Allied piston engine plane with ease. For the first time, Thunderbolt pilots faced an enemy they couldn't chase in a straight line. But the jet's weakness was its vulnerability during takeoff and landing. Allied intelligence quickly understood this, and Thunderbolt groups began hunting near airfields where the Mi-262s operated. On a cold day near Osnabrück, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer, leading a flight of P-47s, spotted the smoke trails of jets returning to base. The Americans climbed, then circled above the field, waiting. When the first Mi-262s came in to land, gear down and flaps open, Meyer led the dive. His 8 guns tore across the runway, and the jets exploded before they touched the ground. Similar encounters followed across Germany. Whenever a Thunderbolt caught a jet unprepared low, slow, or banking the outcome was decisive, the Mi-262 might have been the future, but the Thunderbolt still owned the present. Then came the last desperate act of the Luftwaffe Operation Bodenplatte. New Year's morning, 1945. Hundreds of German fighters launched a massive surprise strike against Allied airfields in Belgium and Holland. The attack began well, destroying many parked aircraft, but German losses were catastrophic. In minutes, the skies turned into chaos. P-47s from nearby fields scrambled to defend what was left in one furious dogfight. Major George Bostwick led his squadron through the smoke and confusion, bringing down several enemy planes before fuel ran out. By the end of the day, the Luftwaffe had lost more than 200 fighters, and worse, the veteran pilots who flew them. The Thunderbolts lost aircraft, too, but replacements arrived within days. The Americans had fuel, factories, and trained men to fill every gap. The Germans had none. In the weeks that followed, German resistance in the air faded to scattered flights and hopeless sorties. P-47s roamed freely, strafing trains, bridges, and convoys retreating toward the Rhine. When the snow melted and Allied tanks rolled east, the Thunderbolts were overhead again, still loud, still unbreakable, carrying the war to its final breath. While German cities were burning and their factories struggled to produce a handful of fighters each month, across the Atlantic, a different kind of weapon was winning the war industry. In vast assembly halls from New York to Indiana, the Republic Aviation Company and its partners turned out Thunderbolts in a rhythm that no enemy could match. The production lines never slept. Men and women worked in 3 shifts, welding, riveting, and wiring the massive airframes under the glow of factory lamps. Each P-47 contained more than 65 individual parts, every one of them machined, inspected, and fitted into place with astonishing precision. Inside the metal skin ran nearly 8 miles of wiring, connecting gauges, guns, and the giant engine that defined its shape. At its height, Republic produced 15 aircraft every day. Other plants built wings, propellers, or engines, then shipped them by rail to final assembly points. Trains rolled out daily carrying rows of silver fuselages bound for the docks, where they were loaded onto Liberty ships and sent to Europe. The numbers told the story better than any speech could. Over 600 Thunderbolts built, millions of rounds of ammunition, thousands of replacement engines, enough spare parts to rebuild entire air fleets. German intelligence analysts saw the reports and understood what it meant. Even if the Luftwaffe shot down one Thunderbolt, another would appear within days, flown by a new pilot trained in months, supported by endless fuel and supplies. One captured German officer later told his interrogators, "We destroyed your planes, but you built them faster than we could count. You drowned us in metal." Behind every mission, behind every pilot who climbed into a P-47, stood the silent army of machinists, welders, and factory workers who never crossed an ocean but changed the course of the war. That industrial heartbeat, steady, relentless, became the true rhythm of victory. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was nearly over. The once proud Luftwaffe was broken, its airfields shattered, its fuel gone, its pilots either lost or captured. Over the ruins of Germany, Thunderbolts still roamed the skies, strafing the last convoys, covering advancing ground troops, and marking the final chapters of the air war they had once entered as outsiders. The Germans who survived those years could not forget the sound of the P-47, the deep, rolling thunder that echoed through the clouds. It had begun as a joke, a machine too big and too heavy to fight. It ended as the most feared engine of destruction in the sky. After the war, when the guns were silent, former enemies began to meet again. At veterans gatherings in the 1950s and beyond, old pilots from both sides shook hands, comparing memories that had once been separated by gunfire. One such meeting took place decades later. Among those present was Adolf Galland, the famed German fighter commander. Standing beside him was Hubert Zemke, once his opponent over Europe. They laughed softly over old stories, not in triumph or regret, but in understanding. Galland was asked what he had thought of the American Thunderbolt during the war. He paused, then replied quietly, "At first, we laughed. We thought it was too heavy to fight, too slow to climb. But we learned the truth. They won because they understood what war had become, not a duel, but an industry." His words carried the weight of experience, and the room fell silent for a moment. Zemka smiled faintly and lifted his glass in acknowledgement. For the men who had flown and fought, there was no hatred left, only memory, respect, and a shared sense of survival. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the plane that had once been dismissed as a flying barrel, had done more than earn its place in history. It had symbolized the will and resilience of those who built it, flew it, and trusted it to bring them home. When the thunder of its engines finally faded from the skies, it left behind not just victory, but a lesson that would echo for generations that courage, endurance, and the power of creation could outlast even the fiercest storm.